Good afternoon. This is Tom Goddard. I'm the CEO of Integral Healthcare Solutions, and I'm delighted you can join us for this webinar today on consumer safety and the URAC standards. It's everywhere. I'm joined by IHS's Senior Clinical Officer, Sue DiMarino, and our President, Leslie Malice-Reed. And we're going to go through a selected group of URAC standards that seem to have consumer safety in mind. We invite you to look throughout all of the standards that apply to your organization to make sure that you're capturing all of the things that URAC cares about. But these are the ones that we really wanted to highlight today when we talk about consumer safety. So with that, I'll let my colleagues introduce themselves more fully than I did. And then we'll circle back around and start our review of these standards. Sue, why don't you tell us who you are and a little bit about your background?
Hi, I'm Sue DiMarino. I've been with IHS for 3 years, and prior to that, I was at URAC for 17 years. I am a registered nurse. I have a master's in healthcare administration, and I am really happy to be here today. Les?
Hi, I'm Leslie. I am the president. Yes. And I was at URAC from 97 till about 2005, where I met these characters, or 2003. And in 2003, I started working at Integral Healthcare Solutions, helping our applicants get ready for accreditation. I have a background from the Canadian healthcare system, and we are very excited to touch upon this standard, this theme of standards today that seems to go through all of the modules. We are going to hope to reach out to a broad spectrum of applicants and modules there. Tom?
Thank you, Leslie. And very briefly on my background, before I founded this firm, I was Chief Operating Officer and General Counsel at URAC, and naturally a whole bunch of jobs before that. And my educational background is I have a law degree and a PhD in industrial organizational psychology. For 32, the senior clinical staff responsibilities. What does this have to do with patient safety?
Well, in that standard, the senior clinical staff person has to be responsible for all the clinical programs within the organization, so that your job description has to clearly describe that that's one of their responsibilities, and then your policy would reflect how that's being done. Like, how are they demonstrating that they're responsible for all the clinical programs? Do they have final review over clinical policies and procedures? Are they the person that's signing off on the, for instance, in Health are they the person that's signing off on the clinical criteria? The other piece to that standard that's really important, then really relates to patient safety, is having the appropriate clinicians making decisions about services that they're going to receive. So how can a plan demonstrate that they're in compliance with that? One way is for the senior clinical staff person to review clinical job descriptions, to be involved in the interview process, to do auditing on the clinical staff, or designating that responsibility to someone else and then reviewing the findings. Those are all examples on how the senior clinical staff person can have oversight of the process and ensuring that they have the right clinicians making those decisions.
What do they mean by clinician or the right clinician? What is that?
The appropriate clinician. So for instance, if you had a behavioral health program, you'd want to make sure that the clinicians had training and experience in behavioral health. You wouldn't want a gerontologist to be the person making those decisions on behavioral health, right? So it has to make sense for the population that's being served. The specialty matching, that's very specific. That's another standard in and of itself.
Yeah, so for another day, maybe that's next month's topic. So
okay, there you go.
Thank you. Farm Core 41. This is for background screenings, and it's really speaking to two different clusters of employees. So I'll take them one at a time. 41A, it requires, first of all, it applies only to employees who have access to consumer personal healthcare information, so PHI or IIHI. If they, those employees who have such access must have a criminal background check done. So make sure you have a criminal background check for every employee who has access to consumer healthcare records. And then the second element within Farm Core 41 is about, applies only to those members of your staff that have access to medications. Now we're going to put in a little caveat here about state regulations in a minute, but this is the URAC standard. So if a particular employee, even if it's not a part of their job to handle medications, if they have access to medications, then they need to go through drug testing and screening, and not just limited to illicit drugs. So do a kind of a full panel drug screen on those employees. Now, there are state regulations for this standard in particular that are more rigorous than that. In other words, might have a much broader implication in terms of who must go through either the criminal background check or the drug screening. So make sure that you have checked your applicable state board of pharmacy laws and regulations before developing your policy around this issue, because as I'm noting, we've seen instances where the state regulation is more rigorous than that. So again, if you have access to, employees have access to consumer healthcare records and personal information, then that requires a criminal background check. And then second, if they have access to medications, then that's drug screening.
I'd like to add something to that.
Sure, please do. Please do.
We've noticed a recent trend when the URAC reviewers come that they actually want to see the results of the drug testing. It wasn't sufficient enough to be able to show that the drug testing was done. There are some state laws that prevent you from sharing that information, so you'll want to be aware of that and work with your without consent from the individual employee. So you may want to work that out ahead of time to make sure that you can demonstrate compliance with that to the URAC reviewer.
The last of the core standards that we want to talk about in this context is Core 38, the Consumer Safety Mechanism. I'll throw this to Leslie.
So this standard, it requires a policy, and it also requires a lot of training to make sure that staff know what to do. But let's break down what URAC is looking for. They're thinking about, first of all, a distressed caller. They think about more than that, but in their definition of a distressed caller, they're thinking about somebody who might call in who is in clinical distress, such as having a heart attack, somebody who's calling in who is going to harm others or harm themselves. And URAC expects your policy and procedure to say something very specific. They want to make sure that the individual on the phone stays on the line at all times, never places the person on a hot, warm, cold transfer at all. They're always going to remain on the phone while they flag a second colleague. So if they're sitting at home as a remote user, they need instant message. And they will flag the second colleague to call 911. They will remain on the phone with this individual until 911 arrives. And this is a really good thing to go over with all of your staff who could potentially be interviewed during your on-site review to ensure that they can tell the same story. We recommend that you go over this maybe 2 weeks before you're on site. So certainly we want everybody to know about it. We want everybody to hold things up in their desk, such as, well, not everybody, but we're hoping to give people tools, because when they do get this emergency caller, they might panic So it's always a good idea to have a red card or a flag or even a stop sign with some of the basic information on it to give people notice of what they need to do, the steps they need to take to be able to address this 911 caller. What we don't want to see is during the on-site for the person to take open the policy and procedure and start reading it. We're hoping they're going to be able to tell the story. They won't get dinged for having that policy and procedure, but we're hoping everybody can tell the same story.
The only thing I'd have to add to this standard is that there's a certain category of consumer safety threats that are within the scope of this standard that I would call the unknowable. You know, that the kind of threat that you can't anticipate. What do you do with that? As long as there's a mechanism in place to elevate the issue to an appropriate level person to handle it, if your frontline staff doesn't have the particular training appropriate to resolve that issue, just have an escalation mechanism, let's say to the chief clinician in your organization or other senior executives, so that everybody has a clear idea of what do you do with a consumer safety issue that you've never seen before and never thought about. Escalate it to somebody who might be able to handle it. Leslie.
You know, one more thing. I said all staff earlier, and the issue is that we expect that really it's going to be your frontline staff who have interactions with consumers to whom the scope of the standard is supposed to be limited to. But I'm going to tell you, in my experience, I was once at an on-site where a consumer call kept getting transferred to the boardroom where us reviewers were. And unfortunately, because of that instance, they have now required that all staff, whether you're in credentialing or IT, they expect your medical director, your HR person to be able to answer this question should they get into a circumstance where there is some caller on the other end in some kind of distress. So please do ensure that your training will address all staff.
That's a good point. In fact, I've heard that story enough times, including quite recently when I was doing a mock validation review for one of our clients, that they have been in a conference room, and as Leslie's example shows, and a consumer got through to them, a phone that you wouldn't expect a consumer to find. So yeah, really everybody's got to get trained on this one. Let's move on to HUM 33, non-certification appeals process. What does this standard have to do with patient safety?
Sure. Health UM 33 and 38 go hand in hand, and it's all about the expedited appeal process. So if you have urgent requests or for services where the patient could be, it could impact their health or impact their ability to maintain functioning, things like that, then you have to have an expedited appeal process. And if you are not contracted to do expedited appeals, then I would tell you you need an attestation that you're going to provide to URAC that says you do not do expedited appeals because you're not contracted, and you can strengthen the submission of your documentation for this standard, if that's the case, by having an excerpt from your contract that states that the health plan will retain the expedited appeal process or the appeal process in general. The other piece about expedited appeals that is very important is the turnaround time. It's 72 calendar hours. I will tell you that organizations struggle with this standard over long weekends, holiday weekends, where they get the request on Friday and they're off Monday because it's Memorial Day or Labor Day, and they don't do the review till Tuesday. You've exhausted your 72 hours. Again, it's 72 calendar hours. This includes the verbal notification requirement. And what we typically see when I'm doing the audits, what is usually missing from the documentation in for expedited appeals, related to expedited appeals, is the documentation of that verbal notification. After you provide that immediate notification to the member, to the provider, then you have 3 calendar days or 3 business days, I'm sorry, to provide the written notification. But it's really important for you to make sure that you're paying attention to the clock. And the other thing that's important to know is that there are a lot of state requirements that are tighter than the 72 hours. So you need to pay attention to the state laws to make sure that there's not tighter timeframes. I believe there's somewhere in New England, I don't remember the exact state anymore, where the turnaround time was 4 hours if the review was received by 2 p.m. on any day. And organizations were really struggling to meet this turnaround time. And they were setting a precedent where they were auto-approving those because of the turnaround time requirements. But then that sets them up for appeals for folks that received, that were sent in timely in order to do the review, like say, in the morning of the day, and it's turned around within the 72 hours, and it's the same type of case, and they approve one and deny another. So you have to be careful about setting those precedents as well. Again, having an expedited appeal process, if it involves urgent care or care could be the health of the patient or their functionality could be compromised without that decision, and then paying attention to the 72-hour turnaround time and making sure that you have that notification, that immediate notification, well documented.
The next one we wanted to talk about is Core 33, which is the basic financial incentive standard. To paraphrase it, Core 33 says if you have a system of financial incentives that is related to consumer utilization of healthcare services, then you need to have mechanisms in place to make sure that no harm comes to consumers as a result of that financial incentive mechanism. Now, for most of you watching this webinar, that's probably going to be not applicable at all. If you don't have any, you may have financial incentives, let's say related to your company's profitability or related to certain quality of performance measures that don't relate to consumer utilization of healthcare services. And if that's the case, then all you'll want to do is prepare a fresh attestation on company letterhead and signed by a senior official in your company that says, we don't have any financial incentives that relate to consumer utilization of healthcare services, and that standard goes away. Now, for the few of you who may have an applicable financial incentive, then you'll need to document and demonstrate through that documentation that you have a mechanism to ensure that looks at things like underutilization or utilization patterns, perhaps overutilization, to make sure that there's nothing going on with those financial incentives that is impacting consumer utilization of healthcare services in a negative way. You'll find this in some quality programs and elsewhere. In fact, this is a good point, that what we need to make sure of, if it's not applicable to you, it's not just an attestation that URAC will accept. It used to be that they did accept just an attestation, but now the interpretation is to submit both an attestation and a policy and procedure that says we're not doing this. And I can see why URAC would do that, because an attestation doesn't bind the organization over time, whereas a policy and procedure does bind the organization over time. You have to change the policy and procedure to allow for financial incentives. And so it kind of makes sense to me why URAC would change its documentary requirements. What have I left out on this?
Well, for those of you who have worked with us, just so you know, these are some of the things that we provide templates for. So we have templates that will help you come up with the right language to be able to make a clear statement that your organization doesn't provide incentives based on a consumer's utilization of care that could negatively affect their health. So we have both an attestation and a policy and procedure embedded in our platform called Goldfinch. I don't know if you want to take a minute to talk about that, Tom, but these are some of the tools that we have to offer you.
Sure. Thank you. I'll be happy to spend a second on this before we go on to the next standard. Leslie mentioned Goldfinch. We'll probably mention it one or two times later on. And just for those of you who haven't interacted with this, this is a proprietary piece of software, online software that helps us and our clients navigate the complexities of a accreditation process, whether it's URAC or ACHC or VIPS or Joint Commission Specialty Pharmacy standards. We can do all, we provide all of our resources in there, like the templates that Leslie was talking about. We have our own interpretive language. We have the accreditation organization's interpretive language. Plus, it's a secure environment for our clients to send us documents, have us review them, score them, give comments, and manage the entire process from gap analysis through mock desktop review, through mock validation review, to use the URAC model. And we adapt it for the other accreditation organizations that we work with as well. So enough about Goldfinch. Let's dive, that was actually a word from our sponsor. Let's dive back into our standards. Let's move on to Pharm Op 15, which is proactive risk assessment.
Okay, so this standard is in the standard that deals specifically with the quality of the program, looking for ways to monitor things like errors and to prevent errors. And the proactive risk assessment, this is something that is done not as a result of an error, but to help prevent an error. And if you go out to, if you look at FMEA and their failure mode and effects analysis, you will find a document that is very long, very thorough, and will take you a great deal of time to fill in and address all the pieces that are required. IHS has created a template that's basically 3 pages long that URAC has accepted, and that addresses all the things that URAC is looking for. So it's when you get a new drug, a new piece of equipment, you're looking at that drug, you're looking at that equipment to see how you can prevent an error from occurring. And then knowing what you know about your organization, how likely are the protocols that you have in place, how likely are they going to work to prevent that error? And it's looking at things like look-alike, sound-alike drugs, training on new equipment, things like that. Medications that are required to be stored in a special way, hazardous drugs. Those are typically the kinds of proactive risk assessments that are done. Now, I strongly recommend that you complete a proactive risk assessment with your application to URAC. That then is something that they can then check off that it's done. If you haven't done it yet, I even strongly recommend that you create your template and at least submit that so that they know that you understand what the responsibilities are. Sometimes folks confuse the proactive risk assessment as your analysis that you've done when you have a big bad error. And that's not the intent. This is done just as the word suggests, proactively, helping to prevent some error from occurring. FMEA has a lot of resources. You can go out to, and I'll put this link for you on ways to implement the failure mode and effects analysis. It's www.ismp.org. I'll put the link for you here so that you have it. You can go there. There's a lot of information that's available. As I mentioned, those of you that have contracted with us, We have a risk assessment template. It's found in Goldfinch under the documents link in this standard, in the PharmOp 15 standard.
Core 24, and I'll toss this one to Sue. Sue, what does Core 24 have to do with consumer safety?
Well, Core 24 has a requirement that anyone who's consumer facing must have a patient safety quality improvement project. And sometimes this scares organizations. They're like, oh my goodness, what am I going to do for patient safety? So I wanted to let you know the URAC's interpretation of patient safety is pretty broad. And as long as you can make an argument on how it applies to your program and your population, typically they accept that standard. Some examples, if you're talking about health it might be your access to service. It might be an expedited appeal turnaround time. So you have to look at your opportunities for improvement. So look at all of your metrics, your dashboard, to see if you've identified anything that you would like to improve, and you can go from there. There are some resources, and if you go into your program guides that URAC provides, they give you a whole list of resources on where you might be able to get safety quality improvement projects.
And Sue, if I may ask you a question, some of our folks are health plans and they're already doing projects for HEDIS, projects that they have to do in the health plan. Are those accepted by URAC as well?
Yes. The health plan standards require that all of their QIPs be clinical in nature. And if you're doing things like, mammograms, diabetes, things like that, you can tie that to patient safety, and certainly one, if not all of those clinical programs will relate.
And what happens?
So this is a distinct requirement from the clinical requirement. So it sounds like this is a subset of clinical. Is that a fair characterization? We got clinical QIPs, and then this says one of those has to be patient safety in addition to being just clinical.
Right, and they can identify which it is, and that's fine.
All right. Thank you.
So for instance, what most organizations will talk about is how they identified the problem, and then what steps did they have to do to mitigate that issue. So did you have to do auditing to identify that you have a problem? Did you have to retrain staff? Did you have to revise policies and procedures? Did you have to put in new workflows? Things like that. Those are all examples. What outreach do you do to the consumer? Things like that. URAC doesn't tell you what those interventions should be. It needs to make what you need to be able to provide to URAC is how it relates to the module, what the issue is, and then what you did about it.
I've heard that described as passing the giggle test. I mean, if you have a quality performance issue, and if you propose an intervention that is quite obviously unrelated, so unrelated as to cause the people in the room to giggle about your intervention, you have not passed the giggle test. So as long as there's a logical connection between what your intervention is and what you're trying to accomplish in your quality improvement project, as Sue said, there's likely not to be any looking over your shoulder as to what you've chosen as an intervention. Now, with one caveat, if this QIP is several years old and you've been using an intervention over and over and over and seeing no results from it, URAC might say, you might want to try a different intervention. This one is not cutting it. And it may not be even the problem with the intervention. It may actually be a problem with data leakage. There might be things outside of your control that are impacting the data in ways that are rendering your interventions useless. So if you do have old QIPs and they're just not working, you might, for URAC's sake, you might want to double check and revisit the choice of interventions. Hopefully that helps. And that's, yeah, Sue.
I was just going to add, and if you're not moving from your baseline to your goal, you need to be doing a barrier analysis to see, okay, is this anything that you can even impact? And at the end of the day, you may want to change your goal. You may want to you may say, we can't make an impact. There's so many variables out there that are impacting our ability to have any influence on this QIP that we need to close it. And URAC's okay with that.
Yeah.
But then you remember, you have to have these QIPs going at all times. So for instance, a health plan has to have 3 going at all times.
Great, thank you. This seems like a good opportunity to talk a bit about specificity, since that was one of the main points you were making about how to kind of walk through, here's what we do in this situation, here's what we do in that situation. That's just a general principle for policies and procedures in the world of URAC. Imagine this, you've got a new employee who's supposed to do this thing, and they get a policy and procedure, and all it says is, you know, the manager of such and such is responsible for doing this thing, and doesn't explain how to do it. URAC has an expectation that your policy and procedure, particularly the procedure part, explains to the staff member how to do the thing they're supposed to do. So be specific and walk through, as Sue described, step by step what needs to be done.
And I agree with you, Tom, but I think there's even greater emphasis in the pharmacy standards.
Yeah.
They want to have the very, very minute details. Who does it? Where's it documented? How's it done? How quickly is it done?
That's right.
If you can answer those questions in the pharmacy standards, you usually do well on your submission to URAC.
That's right. That's right. That's why kind of just submitting some consulting firms templates without like getting down into the weeds with your staff and saying, this is how we do it at our pharmacy. If you rely simply on templates, then without doing that, then that's probably the single most common reason for denial of accreditation for a specialty pharmacy, is that some consulting firm says, oh, we got templates for that, just use these. And we have been told over and over by veteran pharmacy reviewers that that's the most common problem that specialty pharmacies face. So, you know, make sure that you're specific. I'm noticing we're about 3 minutes from the top of the hour, so there are a couple of things I want to tell you about. First of all, let's see if this works. At the bottom of your screen, you'll see an opportunity to schedule a call with Sue, since the bulk of these issues are issues that Sue has the deepest experience in. If you click that button, it'll take you to a piece of software that'll allow you to schedule a call with Sue. That'll work, and it'll take care of time zone differences. So please take advantage of that. If you have any follow-up questions, do write to us. You know, you can go to info. You can send an email at info@integralhs.com, and it'll come right to me. What did I leave out, Sue?
I don't think anything, Tom. I think we're good.
Okay, so I'll put info@integralhs.com in there. Again, that comes right to me. Thank you all so much, and I hope to see you next month on January 30th at 3 p.m. Eastern. Take care.
Take care, everybody. Happy holidays.